Do you remember when you first got the results back, when you saw? What was your reaction?
Oh my, one has high hopes, but one does not imagine zeros, right? So no infections in the lenacapavir arm literally reduced me to tears.
This is the South African scientist Linda Gale Becker talking about lenacapavir, a new drug that's showing very promising results at preventing HIV infection.
I have been doing this for 3 decades now. And, I've just repeatedly been in trials where young women, despite their best efforts, find themselves now living with a virus, and it's a virus they have to live with for the rest of their lives. It has implications for how they have sex, who they have sex with, and countless other very difficult conditions. And seeing no infections in the lenacapavir arm was just, even now when I say it to you, I can actually feel the hair on my head standing up. It is almost miraculous on so many levels.
HIV affects over 38 million people around the world. Thanks to advancements in prevention and treatment, global infection rates have dramatically declined in recent years, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And lenacapavir, while not a vaccine against HIV, could potentially transform prevention, offering new hope in the global fight against the HIV epidemic. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. Today, I'm joined again by Nadine Dreyer, Health and Medicine Editor at The Conversation in South Africa. Nadine, it's great to have you back on the show.
Thank you, Gemma. It's great to be here.
So, Nadine, we just heard a little clip there from Linda Gale Becker about the trial of a new drug that, when injected, can almost entirely prevent HIV infections. Now, I've been speaking to Linda Gale for this episode, but I know you've worked with her quite a bit. Tell us about her and her work.
So Linda Gale is a prominent physician scientist who early in her career saw young people dying from HIV/AIDS, and she was very frustrated at the fact that she could do very little about that. So she's devoted essentially the rest of her life to working on scientific research into HIV. She's a former president of the International AIDS Society and received a standing ovation at this year's International AIDS Conference in Berlin when she presented the results of this trial.
And before we hear a bit more from her about the trial and this new type of preventative drug for HIV, can you give us a brief history of how we've got to this point?
In June 1981, the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported a rare form of pneumonia in young gay men in California. Although they didn't know it at the time, this was the first cases of HIV/AIDS that were documented. And since then, 85 million people have become infected with HIV and 40 million have died from HIV and AIDS-related illnesses. So in the early years, the disease was known as the gay plague because it only seemed to affect homosexual men. We now know that it is far from being a gay disease. And in fact, today women are disproportionately affected by HIV compared to men, with young women most at risk.
And this new preventative treatment that Linda Gale has been trialling is really trying to help those most vulnerable, particularly young women. So thank you, Nadine, for setting out where we've got to so far.
Thank you, Gemma.
When I spoke to Linda Gale Becker, I started off asking how she began researching HIV.
When I came out of medical school, I was quite hell-bent on being a geriatrician and went up to kind of do my bush doctoring up in northern KwaZulu-Natal. And the HIV epidemic was just breaking at that time. And literally all around me, people were dying. I was very frustrated by the fact that seemingly 7 years at medical school had not in any way skilled me to make a difference. So I actually went back to university to become an infectious diseases doctor, and then recognized that what I wanted to do was solve hard questions, and then went on to research, do a PhD, etc. But yes, it's the sort of landing in the middle of the epicenter of the HIV epidemic, which really turned my career in this direction.
And at that time, Who were the people that you were seeing who were infected?
Mostly they were young people, new mothers, breadwinners, and children, babies, were dying in droves around us. Of course, this was the time, it was the late 80s, early 90s, and of course we had no access to antiretrovirals. Antiretrovirals, combination antiretrovirals were just beginning to make a mark in the north, but we had no access whatsoever other than through clinical drug trials. So we put ourselves out there to say, we will do your clinical drug trials because this allowed us to get access to treatment. And this saved the lives of hundreds of people. We still have a good number of people who today are alive because they went onto a clinical drug trial.
One of the most important medical breakthroughs in the fight against HIV has been the development of antiretrovirals. Early versions of these drugs were often harsh on the body.
The early antiretrovirals were tough. They needed to be taken more frequently. There were many more pills. So it actually was very difficult to be adherent in a consistent way. Of course, things have improved greatly since that time. We're now, in the one pill a day combination era, and that's made a big difference.
Today, many more people are now living with HIV rather than dying from AIDS as a result of these antiretrovirals. But what about preventing people from catching the virus?
The mainstay of prevention right in the beginning was this ABC, right? So abstain, behavior, only have one partner at any time, know the status of your partner. And if you can't do any of the above, then condomize. And of course, for some people, that is feasible. For many, all three options are just not something that people can apply to their lives. Of course, abstinence is really completely off whack. Monogamy, although great in principle, is also not always feasible for everyone. And even condomizing can be really tricky. If you're a young woman in the heartland of South Africa, you're having sex for the first time with a slightly older man, there really is very little opportunity to insist on a condom. And so this isn't just, I don't want to do it. Often it is, I actually cannot do it. And so we do need more prevention options. We've been questing for a vaccine for quite a long time. Turns out that HIV is not an easy virus to find a vaccine for.
Why is that?
HIV is quite different to SARS-CoV-2, for instance, in that it's got ways to avoid the immune system. The first is that it's covered with this sort of sugar coating, which dupes the immune system, can't really see the antigenic parts of the virus, unlike that huge spike that sticks up out of SARS-CoV-2. So we don't have an obvious target. Secondly, it changes itself even more frequently than SARS-CoV-2 did. We constantly see the virus mutating away from the immune system, which makes it a very difficult target to catch again. And then thirdly, people just haven't put the kind of money into discovery that we saw, for example, with the COVID-19 pandemic. And so there are very few labs that are really actively looking for vaccines that could work. So the quest goes on, but we haven't found a vaccine. So we need a plan B, if you like. And the plan B has been to move to antiretroviral-based prevention. And that means using an HIV drug, much as we would use for treatment, but now as a pre-exposure prophylactic, a way to prevent HIV by taking the antiviral on board prior to HIV exposure.
These pre-exposure prophylactic prevention treatments are known as PrEP for short. PrEP is taken as a daily pill that reduces the risk of contracting HIV by blocking the virus from establishing a permanent infection in the body. And there's good evidence that it works. Back in 2007, the Pre-Exposure Prophylaxis Initiative, or IPREX, was launched in 4 sites in Ecuador and Peru with the aim of trialling a PrEP medication called Truvada. In 2008, the study expanded to 7 additional sites in Brazil, Thailand, the US, and South Africa, where Linda Gale was involved in this trial.
We had one site in Africa, that was our site in Cape Town, and that was to see if a pill a day could prevent HIV. And indeed, that is exactly what we found it did. It was a combination of 2 antivirals in one pill. One is tenofovir diphosphate, and the other one is emtricitabine.
These two drugs are combined into one pill as Truvada.
And we showed rather modest results in the clinical drug trial, but subsequently this has been shown in real-world environments to be highly effective at preventing HIV. The trick, though, is that you need to take the treatment on board prior to exposure. And that's the standard drug that is available all around the world now. It's completely rolled out, for example, in South Africa. And we now have the greatest number of people who've started oral PrEP in any country in the world.
So you've been involved in numerous drug trials, but most recently you've been trying to find out whether an injection of these antiretroviral drugs could work for prevention. And you've been looking specifically at a drug called lenacapavir. Tell us about this drug and your involvement in the trial.
Yeah, we don't get medication only in pill form. We get it in a number of formulations, and it's been a breakthrough that we now have treatment that is in the injectable depot form. In other words, you only have to have the injection once or 2 monthly. The wonderful thing about lenacapavir is it can actually be administered 6 monthly. So twice a year, you have to take the injection on board, 2 injections given subcutaneously. So it's not an intramuscular injection the way, for example, your COVID vaccines were given. This is under the skin.
Essentially, that means the injection doesn't go into a muscle, but right under the skin. And that means the drugs are absorbed slower by the body over a long period of time.
It's quite a big volume. So how it's given is most typically into the skin of the abdomen, and you administrate or even self-administered, we believe it can be eventually, under the skin. You make a little nodule, and the drug dilutes or dissolutes from that nodule over the 6-month period. So it's like a little capsule, and the drug then quietly goes all around the body and protects against HIV exposure.
Lenacapavir is made by the American firm Gilead Sciences, and it's sold under the brand name Sunlenca. It's a new type of antiretroviral. In 2022, it was approved by the US Food and Drug Administration and other drug regulators in Europe for treatment of people with HIV, in particular what's called salvage therapy.
It's not a great word, but what it means for people who've developed quite a lot of resistance during treatment in their virus. And so it's given to people who have multi-drug resistant virus in treatment. Now, it really lends itself to prevention. So the trials we did was to see if it would be effective against preventing HIV. And that's the study that I was involved in, was called Purpose 1.
In the final, what's called Phase 3 medical trials for lenacapavir, Gilead Sciences conducted 2 separate studies. Purpose 1, which is the study that Linda Gale has been involved in, and Purpose 2, which we'll come to a bit later. Purpose 1 focused on young women aged 16 to 25 and included 5,000 women in South Africa and Uganda, a group experiencing new HIV infections at concerning rates. To ensure the trials targeted populations at higher risk of HIV exposure, the research sites were chosen based on a history of at least 3% HIV incidence in prior studies. Participants were divided into 3 cohorts. The first received the experimental lenacapavir injection, the second took the oral Truvada PrEP, and the third tested a newer daily drug combination that's a slightly smaller pill than Truvada and known under the brand name Descovy. Each group had a corresponding placebo, meaning all participants received both an injection and a pill, but no one knew which treatment they were actually receiving. Lenacapavir works differently in the body to other HIV prevention drugs. It's what's called a capsid inhibitor.
This means that, in fact, it's multi-stage. The antiviral is very effective at stopping the virus getting into the CD4 cell, which is our white cell that it targets, but it also stops the assembly of proteins and the virus then actually leaving the CD4 T cell. So there's a number of places where the antiviral can work, but this capsid inhibitor action is unique. And it means that even if you have a virus that's developed resistance to other mechanisms, this mechanism is very new, and therefore it's very unlikely that people are going to have resistance to this particular mechanism.
In other words, lenacapavir both works to prevent the virus from entering the white blood cells, but if any of the virus does manage to enter those cells, the drug stops the virus from getting out and replicating.
This is why it's so highly effective. It's a wonderful drug, and it has this extensive long half-life, which means we can give it very infrequently, and 6 monthly is really setting a new precedent for treatment.
The interim analysis of the trial was done after 50% of the 5,000 or so women had been followed up for a year, which means most of them had had 2 injections. And the results were outstanding. None of the 2,134 women who received lenacapavir in Linda Gale's trial contracted HIV. By comparison, 16 of the 1,068 women who took Truvada and 39 of the 2,136 who received Descovy contracted the HIV virus. Linda Gale says the initial results were so promising that the monitoring board for the trial recommended unblinding it to allow all participants access to lenacapavir if they wanted it.
This was absolutely unprecedented and just glorious in every sense. These safety boards, we put them in place for a number of reasons. The one is you never want to carry on doing harm if one of the agents is, for example, causing more infection. You would want to stop. You also don't want to carry on if there's no hope of showing any good results. We call that futility. You don't want to waste people's time and you don't want to waste money. Or we stop because it's, a wonderful success.
There's been an ongoing Purpose 2 trial of lenacapavir as a preventative drug for HIV, and the interim analysis of that is also showing promising results. This study involved men who have sex with men, transgender and non-binary people assigned male at birth across Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Peru, South Africa, Thailand, and the US. The full results will be published this month, but in a press release published in mid-September, Gilead Sciences said initial results showed there were only 2 new cases of HIV among 2,180 participants who took lenacapavir. This was compared to 9 cases among 1,087 people in the Truvada group. Gilead says that for this Purpose 2 trial, having a twice-yearly lenacapavir injection was 89% more effective than taking a Truvada pill once a day. Do you think the reasons why it's so effective is just that people don't have to take a pill a day?
Exactly. Young people do talk about the rattling pills. I walk out of the clinic with a bunch of pill boxes that look like antiretrovirals, and it causes a stir, or my family want to know what's going on, or my boyfriend wants to know don't I trust him, etc. And so there definitely are pros and cons for each of the methods, and this is why the best outcome for all of this is that we offer people choice. Today's antivirals are incredibly powerful, but like any medication, it only works if it's on board and there to do the job. And the wonderful thing about lenacapavir is it's there for the 6 months, and we had such a good on-time injection rate that really this population of young women were never without their antiviral protection, if you like. It was like always driving with your seatbelt on, basically, and always stopping at every stop street. That's the analogy.
So now all 5,000 or so women are having the injections?
Well, they can choose. So this is the wonderful thing about it. Everybody's been given an option. If it turns out they were randomized to the oral arm, they can choose to swap to the injectable. If they're on the injection, they can stay or swap to the other. And if they want to actually step away, they also may do so with our blessing, as it were.
Lenacapavir currently isn't approved in South Africa, even as a treatment for HIV. Therefore, the next step, Linda Gale says, is for the WHO to recommend the drug and to recommend it for prevention too.
Then we want to see the agent getting into guidelines, so prevention guidelines. Obviously, we need the WHO to say this is a go, because our countries really follow what the WHO recommends. And then, of course, we need to be talking to countries. How are they going to procure this? How is it going to come into the country? And of course, it needs to be commercialized in countries.
To make sure the drug is accessible, pricing is critical. Currently, lenacapavir is priced at around $42,000 a year if used as a treatment for HIV. Gilead Sciences says that price will not be a reference for the price of the drug if it gets approval for HIV prevention, and that it's committed to developing a strategy that enables broad, sustainable access globally. In early October, Gilead signed licensing agreements with 6 generic drug manufacturers to make low-cost versions of lenacapavir for 120 countries once it's approved, and said it would begin filing for regulatory approval for the drug by the end of 2024. So what impact could this new injection twice a year really have on people in regions with high HIV prevalence?
Well, I think the way to look at this is the bulk of the infections that are happening in my region of the world at the moment is amongst young adolescent girls and young women. So they are far more likely to acquire HIV than their male counterparts. And we're just seeing huge numbers of infections. In South Africa alone, in this last week, we had upwards of 1,000 young women go down with HIV in 1 week. If we can turn that tap off, we will definitely move a giant leap towards controlling this epidemic. And there's no doubt we have never treated our way out of any epidemic. So, of course, it's really important we find those men who aren't in our care, who aren't taking their antiretrovirals, who aren't virally suppressed. We've got to find them. And that is on our agenda. But if we can also protect the young women who aren't yet living with HIV, that is definitely a powerful way to move towards control. And that ultimately is what we need to be doing in the next 10 years, if possible.
This isn't a vaccine. It's not like you can take one vaccine. So with COVID, you'd have one vaccine every couple of years, maybe. You have to keep doing this every 6 months. So what are the challenges of that kind of rolling program?
Yeah, and it's for this reason that I remain a keen vaccinologist as well, and working very hard with my team here to also discover an HIV vaccine, because as you've alluded to, Gemma, is to eradicate this virus, we're going to need a durable, effective vaccine. The difficulty, of course, with the pharmaceutical prophylactics, it does run out. The drug level drops in the body even at 6 months, and then somebody needs to take another agent. And if they don't, the virus could penetrate if people are exposed. The challenge is to have the health systems make sure people understand this, make sure people can come back, and of course that we can afford to have people come back regularly, or people in those countries where they have to buy it themselves, that they can afford to keep coming back.
Linda Gale says that in countries across Africa where people largely rely on public access to healthcare, it's essential that HIV medication is made available for free.
Otherwise, folk will just not be able to access. And so, of course, with an injectable that needs to be administered by a nurse, as it has to be at the moment, or a trained person, that brings people back into the health system. And so we're going to have to figure that out. I think these are all the implementation science questions that we're going to need to answer now in the next few months, now that we've got over the joy and thrill of the result.
So there's a new target that UNAIDS has set for next year, 2025, to have, I think, fewer than 370,000 new infections globally. And then there's this Sustainable Development Goal to end AIDS by 2030. How much closer does this kind of result and this kind of drug get us to that?
I think it makes a significant difference if the phase 3 results are to be believed, and indeed 0 infections. I think ending AIDS by 2030 is going to need quite a combination of factors, not only bringing the number of infections down markedly, but also finding the last 10 million odd individuals around the world who are still living with HIV, and getting into those areas of the world where we don't even know what's happening. Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and so on, other war zones, other areas where people may not be able to access services at the moment. So I'm hedging my bets a little bit with the SDGs, although of course that's a very important target to be reaching for. Certainly reducing AIDS-related deaths, we should be able to do that. We have excellent antiretrovirals. It really is about the last mile now in reaching those individuals and getting them onto treatment and keeping them on treatment. The bringing down the infections, and I would say eliminating particularly vertical transmission. That's the transmission of HIV from mothers to their unborn children or mothers to their babies during breastfeeding. That is a target we absolutely need to set our goals on and make sure that we reach that. That is so within our reach.
But it doesn't also, as you alluded to earlier, it doesn't mean that we're stopping looking for that eventual vaccine that could eliminate the virus.
Yeah, there's viruses that have either been eliminated in the world. Smallpox would be one. Others we're getting close to, polio, etc. This has only been possible because of effective, affordable vaccines, which can be dispensed liberally to people without stigma, without needing to know status. And that's what's made all the difference. So, yeah, the quest for the vaccine must go on.
Thank you, Linda, for explaining your part in this. And let's hope the next part of that story is a positive one too.
Thank you so much indeed. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this week's episode. Thanks to our colleague Nadine Dreyer at The Conversation in South Africa, who we heard from at the top of the show. This episode was written and produced by Mend Marawani, with production assistance from Katie Flood. Sound design was by Michelle Macklem, and our theme music is by Nita Saul. Stephen Khan is our global executive editor, and I'm Gemma Ware, the show's host and executive producer. You can connect with us on Instagram at theconversation.com or email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. Do sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please support us at donate.theconversation.com. And please do also rate and review the podcast wherever you're listening. It really helps. Thanks very much for listening.